Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perikei Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat, Nere Ben Tzvedlana, Aranbad, Menuchato Began Eden, Amen. Rabotai, even after the 8th year has begun, a person is not allowed to buy produce from an Amaretz, an uneducated person, because since the Amaretz is suspected of not observing the halachot of Shemitah properly, the produce that he is selling might have been treated unlawfully during Shemitah. For example, the produce could have come from a field that had been guarded to prevent the public from entering, and we're going to learn later on that you are not allowed to buy Shemitah produce that was not made available to the public. Now, this prohibition of buying from an Amaretz, it remains in place until the 8th year crop of the same type of produce has grown and is being sold in the market, at which point you can assume that the Hamaretz is selling, the produce he's selling is not Shemitah produce, but it belongs to the 8th year. Now, the Mishnah is going to bring a machloket whether the loof plant, either the onion or the bean plant, is an exception to this rule. From when is a person allowed to buy loof in the year after Shemitah from an Hamaretz? Rabbi Yehuda says miyad, a person can buy this loof immediately after Shemitah because we can assume it grew in the year before Shemitah. Now, to understand this, the Rav quotes the explanation of the Yerushalmi that the Mishnah is referring to loof, to this plant, onion or bean that was taken from a storage pile and it was not newly uprooted. Now, a person who buys such a loof at the beginning of the 8th year, he doesn't know whether it was uprooted in the 7th year, in which case it has Shemitah sanctity, or whether it was uprooted in the 6th year, in which case it would not have Shemitah sanctity. Rabbi Yehuda says that it was unlikely that it was uprooted during Shemitah, because like we learned in yesterday's Mishnah, uprooting the loof during Shemitah has to be done in an unusual manner, which makes the task more difficult. Even people who transgress the laws of Shemitah, they're not going to uproot the loof in a usual manner on Shemitah because they're afraid of violating the halacha openly and being caught and penalized. Therefore, we assume that the seller uprooted it before Shemitah, when he was allowed to use the normal tools. If it was still attached to the ground when Shemitah began, he's not going to go through the trouble of uprooting it on Shemitah in order to store it for selling it afterwards. Rather, he would just leave it in the ground until after Shemitah, when uprooting it would be easier. Obviously, we know you're not allowed to buy loof on Shemitah itself because the buyer has to be concerned that the seller uprooted it on Shemitah, because a person would go through the trouble of digging the loof with unusual tools if he intends to sell it right away. If he doesn't intend to sell it until the 8th year, then he would delay uprooting it until then, when the task would be easier. So Rabbi Yehuda says, as soon as the 8th year comes, you can buy it because we assume we uprooted it. It's uprooted produce from the 6th year, but you cannot buy it on Shemitah itself. But the sages disagree. They say, a person can only buy from when the new 8th year crop of loof is abundant. Meaning, according to the Chachamim, we treat loof the same as all other produce, that the buyer has to worry that the loof offered for sale is Shemitah produce until the 8th year crop is available in the market. The Rav tells us, the Yerushalmi explains, that's from Pesach and onwards, and the halacha follows the sages. That is it, Rabotai, Mishnah Hey. Mishnah Vav, we have to introduce a concept brought down in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 19, Pasuk 14. The Torah says you cannot put a stumbling block before a blind man. The Chachamim learn out this prohibition is talking about helping somebody transgress a Torah law. You are not allowed to help somebody transgress a Torah law. And the Rambam explains, why is the Torah calling him blind? Because he's a blind man in the sense that he's being blinded by his urge to sin. So for this reason, you are not allowed to sell certain items during Shemitah to an Hamaretz, because since he is suspected of not observing the Shemitah laws, he might use them illegally. The Mishnah says these are the farming tools that a craftsman cannot sell to an Hamaretz during Shemitah. Macharisha, a plow and all of its accessories. Ha'ol, a yoke to harness an animal to plow. V'amizreh, a winnowing fork, which the Mefarshim explain that after the process of kerneling, when you would when the kernels of the grains are removed from their husks, you would do winnowing. What's winnowing? You would take a large winnowing fork, you would throw the mixture of kernels and the chaff, which is the husk, the stem, the leaves, into the air. The wind blows away the lighter chaff while the heavier kernels fall straight down. Now, generally, winnowing is generally allowed on Shemitah because a person is allowed to reproduce on Shemitah and then process it, which includes activities of threshing, winnowing. However, even these activities on Shemitah are only allowed on a small scale. You cannot do a large amount at one time. So you're not allowed to sell a winnowing fork to an Hamaretz on Shemitah because this tool is only used for large amounts of grain, and that is asur on Shemitah. And the Mishnah continues, vadeker, and a metal tool used for digging. Now, since these tools are only used for work that's asur during Shemitah, the Haaretz will presumably use them for that purpose. Therefore, selling it to him on Shemitah is asur because you're going to be causing him to sin. The Rav does say you can sell these items to a mitzvah observant person, a person who observes the laws of Shemitah, because he presumably intends to use them in the 8th year, even though he's buying them now. The Mishnah continues, but you can sell a hand sickle, which the Rambam explains is used for cutting a handful of stock at a time. You can sell a reaping sickle, which is an ordinary full-size sickle used to harvest produce. It can also be used to cut a small amount. And a wagon, all of its accessories. You can sell these items even to an Haaretz because we are allowed to assume that he's going to use these objects for their permitted purpose. Meaning, the Rav explains, the buyer could use the sickles to reap a small amount of Shemitah produce and then bring the produce home in the wagon. So since these activities are permitted, because a person's allowed to reap enough produce for the immediate needs of his family, you can sell it to him assuming he does that. You're not allowed to harvest large amounts that will be stored for several days. But since these items also have a permitted purpose, a person can sell them even to a person who's not trusted to observe the laws of Shemitah, because even though generally we cannot help somebody commit a sin, that prohibition is limited to objects where the only use is against the halakha. But an item that has a permitted use as well, you are allowed to sell it, provided there's a reasonable chance that the person is going to use it for a permitted reason. The Mishnah concludes, this is the rule. Any tool that is designated only for the transgression of an isur is forbidden to be sold. The isur heta mutar, but a tool that's designated for both permitted and forbidden purposes, then the isur heta, right, for forbidden and permitted purposes, then mutar is permitted to be sold. That is El Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.